The Sunday School lesson for November 1st is Stand Courageously. The main point of the lesson is be ready and willing to stand for God. The focal passage is Daniel chapter 3, verses 13 through 18, verses 26 through 28. Chapter 3 focuses on an incident involving the decrees of Nebuchadnezzar and three of Daniel's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That was a name that their mama gave them. When they entered the service of Nebuchadnezzar, they were given new Babylonian names. Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. Their Hebrew names incorporated the name of God into their name. Daniel means God is my judge, and Belteshazzar means Lord, protect his life. And it's actually probably a reference to the king's, protect the king's life, a prayer for the king's safety, not so much a prayer for Daniel's safety. But that was common to do that with people's names, especially if someone was in the service of the king. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Yahweh is the Hebrew proper name for God. And Shadrach means I am very fearful of God. Mishael means who is what God is. And Meshach means who is like Aku. And Aku was one of their gods. So it's kind of an equivalent name, just changing the names of the gods. Azariah means Yahweh is a helper. And Abednego means servant of the Shining One. The Shining One is the name of one of their gods. It was common to invoke a blessing or a praise of God in a name. Other ancient peoples did the same thing. The Babylonians simply assigned them the equivalent names in their language. This included praise or prayers to the pagan gods. It was also common in the ancient world to have a name in the language of the land you lived in, as well as a name belonging to your people. Among the Jews, Daniel would have been addressed with his Hebrew name, but among the Babylonians, he was Belteshazzar. In the New Testament times, Jews often had their Hebrew name, but they would also have a Roman name or a Greek name, depending on who they did business with the most, simply because it was easier for people to speak a name in their own language. It was easier, if you were speaking Greek, to have a Greek name than trying to transliterate it and change it into a Hebrew name. People do the same thing today. When I was in college, I had several friends from Israel who were students at my college. One was named Samir. Everyone just called him Sam. Sam was easier than Samir. Another friend was Bashira. And Bashira, that was difficult for a lot of people to say in South Georgia. We were taking French class together, which he had the advantage since he had lived in Paris at one point. But we were taking a class and we were introducing ourselves. And he said he worked at a local convenience store, and they had to rename him. Bashir was just too hard for the locals. So they called him Bob. And in class, we were introducing ourselves to the teacher and to fellow students, and he said, "My name is Bashira, but everyone here calls me Bob. I cannot wait to get home and get my name back." So, again, people do the same thing today. Just reassigning names for making it easier in the language you're dealing in. Chapter 3 deals with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were officials in the Babylonian Empire. Noticeably absent from the chapter is Daniel. It could well be that Daniel was dispatched to a different area by the king on official business. The crisis begins in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. The king was inspired to build a giant monument in a plain approximately 16 miles south of Babylon. The king may have been inspired by the dream of the giant statue he had seen in chapter 2. The top of the statue in his dream was gold, and it represented his empire. He may have made the statue in order to celebrate or pay homage to the gods for such a positive dream. Even though Daniel praised the true God for the dream and its interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar probably interpreted the dream according to his own understanding of his gods. He had not reached a point where he could understand that there was one true God. It was not unusual for ancient kings to erect massive statues and monuments. Just think of the Sphinx in Egypt, which is 240 feet long and 66 feet high. The Colossus of Rhodes, one of the ancient wonders of the world, was 105 feet tall. Nebuchadnezzar's statue was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Most historians think that the statue was made of other materials and then covered with gold. Or most of the structure was covered in gold while the top was solid gold. A statue that large of solid gold would have had insufficient structural integrity and would have collapsed. Gold is not really a strong, good building material. Regardless of the ratio of gold in its composition, it would have been an impressive sight. People would have been able to see the glitter of the gold for miles around. After constructing the statue, Nebuchadnezzar began to gather in the officials of his government from Babylon and the surrounding areas. He really wanted everyone in the empire to come, and eventually they may all have journeyed to the statue. It would have taken some time to gather everyone in, and the events of the chapter appear to take place rather quickly after its construction. Nebuchadnezzar then ordered that the band start to play, and that everyone was to bow to the idol. Again, this was not uncommon in the ancient world. Kings expected their people to worship their God. Religion was not a personal matter, but it was mainly a national and community matter. Ancient peoples tended to believe in multiple gods. The Babylonians would have had no trouble accepting the existence of the Hebrew God, but they would have thought him second class to their own. After all, in their mind, the Babylonian gods had defeated the God of the Hebrews. They would have expected deference from all the people that they had conquered to their gods, just as they expected deference for themselves. The conquered peoples were permitted to worship their gods as long as they recognized the Babylonian gods as superior. This was also a matter of loyalty. To question the king's gods was to question the authority of the king. The king wanted everyone to pay homage to the idol as a means of showing their allegiance to the Babylonian Empire. It was as if he was asking them to make a pledge of allegiance to the statue, and anyone who failed to do so was considered a traitor. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were assembled with all the other leaders and advisors to pay their respects to the idol. However, the three would not bow when the music started to play. They were the only ones standing amongst the thousands that filled the plain. The king, though, would not have seen them. They probably could have stood without being noticed and gotten away with it. However, there were certain individuals who were jealous and hostile to them. We see this throughout the book of Daniel, that there are non-Hebrews who are hostile towards Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, because they are so successful, and also because they're Jews. There is a degree of anti-Semitism within the Persian Empire at this time. In the Babylonian Empire. They had hit that same strain of anti-Semitism within the Persian Empire as well. Well, their enemies saw that they did not bow and immediately informed on them. Daniel 3:8. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man should hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worship, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. The three were charged with disregarding the king's commands, blasphemy, and treason. The word of the king was law, and it was absolute. They were not to question or protest the commands of Nebuchadnezzar. They were also showing grave disrespect to Nebuchadnezzar's gods. Finally, they were demonstrating that they were not loyal citizens of the empire. This, of course, did not sit well with the king. Daniel 3:13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up. Now if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye shall fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Nebuchadnezzar was outraged at the charge leveled against these three men. He had spent a great deal of time and resources having them trained to work in his government. Their actions at the very minimum were a sign of disrespect and a lack of gratitude. He was angry and could have had them immediately executed. However, Nebuchadnezzar was a fair man and gave them a chance to explain themselves. Further, he was willing to give them a second chance. This would also be a way of seeing if the charges were accurate or not. He's given them a fair hearing. If they're willing to bow down and worship to the idol, then he'll know that those other men, their accusers, were acting more out of self-interest and jealousy than actually being concerned about these three men being loyal citizens. They could have denied it and benefited from it. They could have had the accusers thrown into the furnace for a false accusation. But Nebuchadnezzar is giving them the benefit of the doubt. He's willing to give them a second chance to prove their loyalty. And this time he explicitly directed them to bow to the idol once the orchestra started to play. They could have denied the charges and they could have bowed to the idol. No one would have blamed them because their lives were on the line. Nebuchadnezzar pointed out the precarious situation. If they failed to obey, then no one and no God could save them from Nebuchadnezzar. He was certain that he had absolute power over their lives. Daniel 3:16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied that there was no need to strike up the band, and that there had been no understanding. The charges were true. They had not bowed to the idol, and they would not bow even if it meant their lives. They were not being disrespectful to the king, but they were bound by a higher authority. God commanded in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Of course, we recognize that as the beginning of the Ten Commandments. These three men knew the law of God and its demand that God alone should be worshipped. They were going to be obedient to God no matter what threat the king threw at them. The king had laid down the challenge that no one or no God could save them. They confidently replied that if their God wanted to save them, then there was nothing that Nebuchadnezzar could do to harm them. They were not being boastful about their worth before the king, nor were they being disrespectful. They were being good witnesses of the true God. They knew that God could deliver them if he chose to do so. However, the potential of delivery was not what motivated them. They were confident that God could save, but they didn't know if he would or not. They were confident, though, that no matter what happened, they would not bow to an idol. God would either save them by delivering them from the fiery furnace, or they would die and be in God's presence, and they would be delivered from the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Either way, they felt like they were on the winning side. It is important to understand that they did not base their response on the guarantee that God would save them. They knew that He could, and they trusted Him one way or the other. The important thing is that they were willing to be faithful regardless of the consequences. The consequences were abrupt and deadly. The king ordered that the men be thrown into a great furnace. Likely, this was a furnace that was constructed for the purpose of refining metals and firing bricks used in the construction of the idol. It was a massive furnace that would have generated a great deal of heat. The king ordered that they turn up the temperature to maximum level and that the 3 traitors be tossed in immediately. A group of elite soldiers were ordered to carry the 3 and toss them into the furnace. The 3 were bound and thrown in. The furnace was so hot that the men who carried the 3 Hebrews were killed. Yet the king noticed something strange almost immediately. Verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king, astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. The king had stationed himself to observe the death of the 3 men. However, he did not see 3 men incinerated. He asked his advisors to confirm the number of men that had been thrown in. They all answered that it had just been 3. But Nebuchadnezzar was able to see 4 men walking around within the furnace. He also observed that though they had been bound before being thrown in the fire, they were now walking about freely, and the 4th man he saw was like the Son of God. They were unharmed. They were even comfortable. There was no pain. There was no problem with these men being within the fire. And the 4th man was beyond his comprehension. It was obvious to Nebuchadnezzar that the 4th man was a divine being. There was something spectacular about him. The king recognized that divine power was at work, and he didn't understand it. But at that point, he recognized that the 3 Hebrews were correct and he was wrong. He went as close as he could to the entrance of the furnace and called out to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He called and he gave honor to God. He realized that none of his gods would have been able to pull off such a feat. The God that these 3 men worshipped must truly be the best God of them all. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of the furnace, and their clothes were not even singed, their hair was fine, and they didn't even smell smoky. Nebuchadnezzar realized that God had saved the 3 by sending an angel to save them because they were faithful to their God. After the king declared that no one should dishonor or blaspheme against the God, after that, the king declared that no one should dishonor or blaspheme against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. A measure of religious tolerance was provided to the Jews in exile because of the miracle and witness of the 3 faithful men. Further, Nebuchadnezzar bestowed honor and authority upon the 3. He wanted to make up for the offense of attacking the servants of a powerful God, and he wanted them on his side. Now, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is remarkable. God used them to show a pagan king who the real God really is. This also provided some religious tolerance for the Jews as a whole. They bravely stood for their faith in the face of imminent death. They knew God could deliver them, but they also knew that God could also let them die. Either option did not matter to them because they were going to remain strong in their devotion to God. Throughout history, men and women have been required to make a choice between their faith in God and life. Sometimes it worked out. Martin Luther on October 31st, 1517, posted a list of complaints against the Roman Catholic Church. He pointed out the problems of the church in his day and where it strayed from the Bible. At one point, he was brought before the supreme authority of the land, and he was commanded to repent of his position. Before the most powerful men in the world, Luther proclaimed that he would stand upon the Scriptures and would not back down even if it meant his life. He was able to escape with his life and continue to turn the church back to the teachings of the Bible. In fact, at that point is when he began in earnest to translate the Bible from Latin into a language that his people could understand. He translated his Bible into German. And by the way, that laid the foundation for the later English translations. Others were not so fortunate. 102 years earlier, a man named Jan Hus had tried to do the same thing. Even though he was offered safe passage to present his teachings to the authorities, they changed their minds and killed him. He died for his faith, even though it would be 100 years before someone was successfully able to stand up for the true faith. History is filled with men and women who gave their all for the cause of Christ. There are times when Christians are going to come into conflict with the authorities of this world over our faith. Standing before the Sanhedrin, the highest authority of the Jews, Peter was commanded to stop talking about Jesus. Acts 5:29, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." Later, Peter and John would be beaten for preaching the gospel. They didn't complain, but rejoiced that they had the opportunity to suffer for the sake of the gospel. Jesus declared in Matthew 10:32, "Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven." This doesn't mean that Christians will always experience a happy ending on earth. The early church grew because of men and women dying for their faith. We are not faced with such a difficult prospect at the moment. However, we have brothers and sisters in Christ around the world that do face the choice of faith or life. And they choose faith even when it means their death, often in a horrific fashion. If they are willing to take a stand in such a difficult situation, then how much more should we take a stand when there is no real threat against our lives? One day we will be held accountable for our silence in the face of peace, when so many others proclaim the gospel in the face of certain death. We must take our stand for Jesus. Stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory, his army shall he lead, till every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey. Forth to the mighty conflict in this his glorious day. Ye who are men now serve him against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger, and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, stand in his strength alone. The arm of flesh will fail you, ye dare not trust your own. Put on the gospel armor, each piece put on with prayer. Where duty calls or danger, be never wanting there. Stand up for Jesus, the strife will not be long. This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song. To him who overcometh, a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally. Thank you for watching. I pray that this lesson has been informative and a blessing. Please share this lesson with others, and if you are able, I'd like to invite you to join us at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Ebenezer Baptist Church is located at 7305 Highway 166 in Douglasville, Georgia. Sunday school is at 9:45 a.m. and morning worship is at 11 a.m. We also have an evening worship service on Sundays at 6 p.m. We have a weekly prayer meeting at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. Additionally, if you have any questions about the lesson or have any prayer requests, please email me at pastorterrybraswell@gmail.com. Thank you.